We chose at the beginning of Heavy Rain to introduce the interface in a scene that all players are familiar with, waking up in the morning. The player comes to grips with the interface while performing everyday actions. As he discovers the controls, he interacts with his environment in the simplest way possible. Progressively, and without realizing it, he takes on the role of Ethan Mars in his everyday life. This scene, which seems to be extremely simple, took a very long time to put together. In the very first version, the house had only one floor, and the scene began directly at Ethan's drawing board, where the player learned the game controls. Then it developed with the addition of an extra floor in order to introduce Ethan more progressively with the wake-up scene. The scene became a little sandpit where the player is free to choose what Ethan does. For example, whether he works at the drawing board or wanders into the garden while waiting for the family to come home. The scenes with the kids were obviously absolutely essential to the story.
That's it, I'm free as a bird!
We had to build up the relationship with the kids at all costs, establish this well-balanced and loving father in order to have the player really implicated in his father role later on. Playing with the kids, making them laugh, engaging in a sword fight with his son, all of these are taken from the life of all fathers and really get the player into his role as a father. All the motion capture animations of the kids were recorded with real 8 and 10-year-old kids, Taylor Gassman for Jason and Quentin Cage for Sean. The dead bird sequence closes the scene like a sort of omen.
What's up?
It's Merlin dead and it's all my fault.
No, it's not, Sean. Of course it's not your fault.
Sean is confronted with death for the first time. Ethan has to respond to his son's sadness.
There are some things which just have to happen, even if you don't want them to.
His response, which is one of resignation, is an admission of his own powerlessness when faced with death. It is a forerunner of what is to come. The mall scene is the central scene in Heavy Rain, the one where everything changes in a matter of seconds.
It was extremely important for me to have the player playing the scene and the first scene in Ethan's home. We could simply have shown the scenes in a cutscene, but the player would have not felt implicated in the same way. Playing a scene or merely watching it completely changes the player's relationship with the story and his identification with the character. So it was imperative for the player to experience these scenes with Ethan rather than just showing them. The player doesn't just know Ethan's history. He has lived it with him, he knows what he lost, and he feels the guilt.
The scene is really quite simple. The player loses his son first time, but quickly finds him again near the clown. When Jason disappears a second time, we change the animations for Ethan's movements to make him look more panicky. The calm camera at the beginning of the scene becomes a handheld camera. The music increases the pressure on the player. We used the same mechanisms as film to create the dramatic tension in a classic manner.
This sequence is the perfect example of what every sane video game developer avoids like the plague. It lasts about 5 minutes in all, but it took us almost 2 years to develop. Managing a crowd in which the player can move freely means managing around 1,000 passers-by at the same time. We had to use a lot of tricks to get around the technical constraints. To optimize the calculations, the game program masks all the passers-by that are not in sight, while continuing to simulate their movements and their animations. If the player turns his head very quickly, the paths of the crowd members remain consistent, even if they have not been displayed for a time.
Then, all that remains is to bring the camera closer in order to increase the agonizing impression of being with Ethan. Here again, classic movie directing.
The accident scene is one of the rare sequences that I storyboarded before filming it. It is quite a complex sequence with a lot of things happening at the same time. There is Ethan coming out of the mall, Jason who is lost, the car coming. By using 3 windows, we could tell these 3 stories at the same time and lend a particular style to this scene.
The player loses his son in this scene. Everything that happens is his fault. The aim of this scene was really to create a very powerful feeling of sadness, almost depression, a feeling that is rarely presented in such a tangible manner in interactive experiences.
This scene is one of my favorites in Heavy Rain. Everything depends on the relationship the player decides to have with his son. He can decide to play the responsible father who looks after his son and tries to reestablish bonds, or he can be the father who is crushed by sadness and guilt and who prefers to turn in on himself. Both attitudes are consistent with the character, and it is the player's actions that dictate Ethan's attitude after the accident.
The depressing atmosphere in the house is based to a large degree on dynamic management of light and shadows in order to imitate fading light at the end of a fall afternoon. The sun goes down, the shadows lengthen, and the light begins to fade until it plunges the house in darkness. The scene requires management of the boy's behavior. Goes to the bathroom, gets himself something to eat, and falls asleep on the sofa. Whether he was a good father or a negligent father, the player is now bonded to his son because they have shared something together. This bond will build up the player's motivation to recover his son after he disappears. Through his choice of actions, the player contributes to building up the character and his motivation.
No!